we haven't had a chance to talk about this, and I'm so excited that I get to with you here. Every choice in this film is so every movement in the film is so considered and strong and deliberated over clearly. Could you talk a little bit about the passage from when you first decided you might want to do this to how we got here? Because there's nothing, obviously it wouldn't be, but in a craft sense, but also in a personal sense, none of this is done lightly. Right. So could you talk a little bit what it took to get here?
Yeah, I mean, making Strong Island was sort of equivalent to making a filmic version of the Odyssey. We were on, first of all, my brother was murdered when I was an art student, so I immediately began incorporating his death into my work then. I got to a point in my life, though, where I realized that I was either going to, never tell anyone about my family story, or I was going to make a film about it, one or the other. I made, with one team, a 3-hour cut. I looked at it and I said, this isn't the film I wanted to make. I started over from the beginning, and as a result of collaborating with a Danish editor, a Danish co-producer, a new producer, Jocelyn Barnes, who wishes that she could be here tonight but can't, all of the deliberateness that we put into shooting the film, like there are thousands of decisions, thousands of things that I had already knew that I wanted to try to capture on film before we shot. And, that we labored, Alan Jacobson and I, so intensely to capture precisely the thing that I was looking for. We went back and started over with the expressed idea of every shot being the shot for that particular moment in the film. And that's where the sort of the skill and the experience of Yance came in as well. But it's a series of literally 10 years of work, and I would say millions of decisions to arrive at this point.
And then there's to what degree are you? I mean, this is incredibly complicated, and I don't mean to simplify it at all, but for the purpose of asking the question. The degree to which you're working through something for yourself and working through something that's communicating something to other people, and how are you balancing those two things at once? Because they're not always the same answer.
Sure.
Yeah.
The work that I did for myself, I did over the course of the 25 years, after my brother was murdered. Yance, the character in this film, is being asked questions that have never been asked before, and saying things that she's never said before. And that revelation, those bits of secrets that come out of that character, that's for the benefit of the audience and for the benefit of the story. But the personal work in terms of who I am in life and who I am on the screen are completely separate. And I wouldn't have actually been able to do the work for the screen if I actually hadn't as many, family members who've lost loved ones to any type of trauma, but particularly the specific racialized violence of America. I wouldn't be able to do these interviews, over the course of 4.5 years if I weren't able to have gotten to a place in life where I knew how to talk about my brother's death in the context of America.
And so was there some element of dissociation in terms of playing this character? Were you distanced at all? Did you have to be somewhat distanced from the work that you had done for all those years leading up to that in order to shoot these scenes?
I think that it's not so much dissociation as it was maturity. If I had tried to make this film when I was an art student, it would have been a disaster. With time and with insight, I came to understand that the story was not what happened. The story was why, right? The question is, why is it reasonable for someone to shoot someone else in a situation that is clearly, involves one person with one weapon, and have that be deemed by our legal system as a justifiable act? So that's really where, that's where I landed.
that you make several choices straight off where you basically reveal certain pieces of information within the first couple minutes that I think if you were making a different type of film, would be things that you'd reveal later on for the audience. But you're letting us know straight off. This is not about what happened. This is about why.
Yeah. You know, and I also say, if you're not interested, get up and go.
Yeah. Nobody left, that's
No,
for sure.
which, you know, when I said that, I was like, this, you know, my editor and I got to know each other so well. I didn't actually see, you know, he cut that sort of early in the morning one day, and I got to the edit suite, and he said, I have a new opening to show you. I mean, it was the same opening, but he just put that little thing in there, and I was like, that's me.
Yeah.
Right? That's me. And every single, you know, decision about what Yance the character said was and did. Those interviews were excruciating. I set up a wall of sound blankets between me and the entire crew. I never knew a single question going in to my interviews. They were always, you know, sort of generated by the editor in consultation with my producers. And the only thing I ever saw in the room where I was interviewed, right, which was actually 2 different places, but my DP is so brilliant that it looks like the same place. I saw 2 marks, 1 on each lens, and 2 lenses, and a stalk of a C-stand.
Okay.
I tried to create as much of a void as I could. I tried to be as alone in a space with other people as I could in order for the character Yance to step out of the role of director Yance and answer the questions as honestly and as thoroughly as I could. I hope it worked.
It sure does. It sure does. Anybody have any questions for Yance?
There's a hand here.
Oh, yes, right here. I think there's a microphone coming, so just give us a second.
Yeah. Is there any way we can bring these spots down?
Yeah, it's pretty intense, isn't it?
Or not?
Oh, yeah. Go ahead, please.
Hello, it was amazing. Thank you so much for making it. Like, really intense. I guess my question is a kind of, it's a question within a question, because I'm questioning it as well. Mm-hmm. It's incredible that you've managed to create this extremely personal narrative of, I think, a narrative that is becoming more and more prevalent and familiar, which is this kind of injustice. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really interesting the way that you've also talked about your queerness as well, and how that kind of unknowing and those questions around that, and also what you just said again about, you know, going into your interviews without knowing anything, like asking these questions. Could you maybe talk about that relationship and kind of how you've thought about your relationship, your personal history, and your queerness, and sort of broader narrative of African Americans?
Sure. You know, there's a line in the film that I think answers your question really well. And it comes toward the end, where it says, "Dredge the river and you will find him, or someone who could have been him." And then there's the reference to my grandfather being allowed to essentially suffocate in a colored waiting room in a hospital in Charleston, South Carolina. This kind of racialized violence, whether it's the passive kind of you have to wait until we have time to treat you, or the very active and aggressive, we are, you know, going to allow someone to shoot you without justification and say that it was okay. It goes much farther back than anyone actually. Social media allows us to see it now, but it has always happened, right? If we go back and, for example, just Google, you know, lynching photographs, you will see photographs of this kind of public violence and the display of the brutalized black body that you know is as old as photography itself. So, you know, putting my brother's death, putting my grandfather's death, putting my father and my mother's death ultimately on that line of violence and on the repercussions of that violence, I thought was essential for the film. And also the undercurrent of self-discovery and also secrecy, right? But even within that secrecy, parents knowing and loving their children regardless. My mother, when I came out to her, said, I always knew. My father was like, I always knew. And my parents loved me anyway. They never stopped loving me. And so to have my queerness be something that my character struggled with, but that my parents did not, was really essential to the film, because that's actually the experience that was my life at that age. And so, you know, a black family sort of intact, loving one another in complicated ways, I thought was my experience, and important to be, you know, sort of the anchor of the story. We don't start with the murder, right? That's the thing about this film. It doesn't start with a murder. It starts with a family, and it goes from there.
Anybody else with a question? Yes, right over here. Microphone. There's a microphone coming right behind you.
Yeah, it's a question about, I guess, how you disconnect or connect with yourself, as you said, Yance the director and Yance the sister and person in the film. And so the sequence where you're crying, quite intense sequence, how did you direct that?
So that is a question that often gets asked of me. We, and when I say we, my DP and I, were setting up that day to make phone calls. We had set up, we always shot with two cameras, a 5D and a C300. And I always shot at my desk. And the light that you see that's lighting my face, my desk faces a window that faces east. So I get a lot of light, you know, for most of the morning. We set up the shots. I was in focus. We taped my chair to the floor so it wouldn't move back or forth. And then we went to have lunch. We were sitting at my dining room table and the phone rang. I saw on the caller ID on the portable handset that it was the U.S. Attorney's Office. We ran, literally, mouths full of food from the dining room in my house into the living room to my desk. And that's how that phone call unfolded. And that's why I think it was because Alan had to react in the moment. The focus on the C300 was set, right? But he had to pull focus on the 5D. So when you think that I'm there by myself, and then all of a sudden you see someone rack focus and you realize that there's actually somebody operating the camera, that's how that scene actually evolved. And I could have reached out and touched Alan, and Alan could have and wanted to reach out and touch me. But he did his job as the DP, and I did my job as the director, which was to focus on the phone call and to try to get this woman to give me any information which clearly she did not want to give.
I saw a few other hands. There's one right here.
At what point did you know that you would format it with these layout of the photographs, which was really beautiful, along with the really impactful interviews? You know, you could have done reenactments, or there's lots of different techniques you could have used. But at what point did you decide that you would sort of use this type of format?
When I thought of the film. Honestly, this is the kind of, when I think of what a film is supposed to be, when I think of a documentary, when I think of the kind of film that I want to make, this is what comes into my brain. Like, I don't have to start from someplace else and then move away, right? This is what the ideas look like coming out of my head. Essentially, the overhead shot of the photographs came from my experience as a work study program at my college, where I worked at the museum and I documented the prints. And so I used a regular 35mm copy stand. And I told my DP, I want to shoot overhead like a copy stand. And so we essentially created the world's most expensive copy stand using a C300. The photographs, though, changed in their energy and effectiveness from the beginning, where I was just moving them in, shooting static amount of time, and then moving them out, to after my mother passed away, and the number of photographs literally doubled, because we went through the house and I found much more photographs. When my producer was like, like, do something with them. You know, like, these aren't specimens. This is memory. And so when the tactileness of the photographs and my interacting with them became part of how they were handled, that's when they changed. And that's when the I don't know if it's magic or something, but that's when they become relatable, right? That's when they start to resemble something that you have in your house, right? Or you have in your drawer that your kids will have one day, or your nieces or nephews will have, like crazy photographs of when you were young. That's, it's all about the charge and the handling.
And to me, it doesn't come off as technique. It is technique, but it doesn't read that way at all. It reads like a sincere identification, ownership, relationship with the photos, which I think that also is something similar with the scene you just described with the phone call, where yes, you notice this, you could, if you're paying attention that way, you notice the focus changing, and there's a person there. You're not alone in that room. But it speaks to a seriousness of purpose and commitment to a decision, that there's not that line being crossed. And I think that's throughout. There are those choices that are remarkable. Was there any other questions? Oh, there's one right over here, if you don't mind. Yes.
Thank you so much. Hi, your film was incredible. I just wanted to know if your mum got to see any of it, and what was her reaction to the whole project?
My mother was thrilled every time that we asked her to have an interview, to come out and like drop all of her stuff at the house and shoot around the neighborhood. Sort of occupy her entire space all weekend long and just shoot exteriors. The entire block was always, they always said yes. My mother never said no. My mother died before the film was finished. My mother's death became one of the storylines in the film. So she knew that it was being made. She was very glad that it was being made, but she didn't live to see it out in the world.
What was it like to interview her? Were you playing a character of sorts as well to interview her, or was that just the two of you?
That's the two of us. With my mother's toes and how she loved the shoes. You have no idea how long the shoe portion of that interview actually was. My mother tells stories about my father working at the shoe store so much. My mother had so many shoes. That was my relationship with my mother. When she says it's not when I met him, it's when I became aware of him. That's she means exactly that. And she would be able to put her finger on the second of the hour of the day when she became aware of my father. And it would be accurate and true.
Yeah, that describes some of the most romantic expressions I've ever seen or heard, is the way that she speaks about him in those early moments. Unbelievable.
I didn't inherit any of that.
Anybody else? The question. Yes? There was a second. You get a second question, then there you go.
I just wanted to know, since finishing the film, has it been sort of given you a sense of closure, or is that did you in one sense make the film to get a sense of closure, or is it also to raise this issue of injustice and to hope to I guess prompt change or awareness?
I made the film very simply to demonstrate how easy it is to kill black people in America and get away with it, and to extrapolate from that how easy it is to kill people of color all over the world and get away with it. Like, bottom line. I think that closure is something that people who haven't experienced death or trauma or any kind of unexpected loss of life come up with to sort of assure themselves that if they ever had to deal with a situation where there was extreme trauma, that there would be a point at which it ended. I think that people who have experienced this kind of thing will tell you that it's not actually, it doesn't ever actually close. it evolves, it becomes something that you live with, it becomes a part of your life. But for me, this film is not about closure. This film is specifically about showing who gets to be afraid, who gets to be blamed for their own deaths, and how we need to very seriously ask ourselves what is going on. And I know what's going on. And there are many people in this audience who know what's going on. But there are lots of other people who will see this movie and know that this death happened in 1992 and will have thought that the first time it happened was 2012 with Trayvon Martin. And that's where, that's where the importance of the story lies. We need to be asking ourselves questions about what is reasonable fear. You can be afraid, right? That's fine. Lots of people are afraid of lots of things, but if that fear is reasonable, it's something that we need to decide. And so far, in our record in the States is all these killings have been reasonable, with the exception of the guy who got shot running away from a police officer, and only because it was taped, right? Every single killing is justifiable.
Oh, there is one more question. I was just, while you bring the mic over, you mentioned the answering to the idea of closure. I think the film itself defies that notion too. You're constantly looping back and forward and back and forward. It's not about arriving to some final moment where it's.
And that's the whole thing about memory and time, right? And Lyric, who was pitching today at the chicken and egg thing, said, like the government has one truth, right? Yeah. And that's because the truth is authored.
Sure.
Right? But the real truth is complex. It's complicated. And they don't, the ends don't meet. There's always ambiguity. Yeah. And it's the ambiguity that people have to learn to live with, not closure.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you for such a raw, honest portrait of you and your family.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I wanted to ask, in relation to kind of modern day, more recent, events, like you mentioned. First of all, what was the response in the US of your family and friends and the wider community in the US of this film? And second of all, have you been in touch with any of the families that have lost loved ones recently, and what's their reaction and your dialogue with those families? So wider reaction and any communication with these families recently?
Sure. Communicating with families who have lost loved ones to traumatic violence is a part of our outreach and engagement strategy that will happen when the film sees wider release. We are still in our festival run. And when you're at film festivals, you think that everybody knows about film festivals, and the truth is that most people, most ordinary folks who get up and put their kids on the bus in the morning won't see this until they see it on Netflix. And when they see it on Netflix, that's when the discussion will begin, sort of writ large. Writ small, it's been conversations like this, and the responses at festivals from all over. From Toronto to Columbia, Missouri to the Berlinale have been tremendous. But I look forward to bringing this film into the world because I think that it's needed now.
Yeah, one more question, which is over here, right behind you on the aisle. There you go.
Thank you. My question is actually a little bit more of a comment. I was just wondering, watching the film, that you kind of blamed yourself at one point, which I think is pretty terrible thing to have, and if you have dealt with it, and after the film, but also I wonder in my mind is what happened actually in those few seconds inside when your brother went in. And did that guy really, did he want it to actually shoot him? Did he go inside specifically to take that gun and shoot him? Or, and following, do you think the justice system would have, if it was a white man going after him, do you think that would have changed the course of this? Would he be, would he go to trial? Would he be convicted?
If my brother had been white,
Yeah.
Mark Riley would still be in jail.
So he would go to jail. He would be trialed.
Mark Riley, if my brother had been white, Mark Riley would still be in jail.
And what happened, do you think, in those few seconds inside?
I think it's obvious. I think that we know from Kevin exactly what happened. I think that, the coroner's report that I read from tells you what happened, right? My brother turned the corner and he was shot. There was no evidence of close-range firing. So the scientific evidence says one thing, and the narrative of the investigation almost reads like a victim's statement, right? And butting those two things up against one another in the film is done deliberately, right? Because science can tell you that there's no gunpowder stippling or soot around the wound, which means that that he was shot from at minimum of a certain distance. You have to be at close range to have gunpowder stippling and soot, right? And so you can't shoot someone. You can't have someone advance toward you. And you can even listen to the language of the investigator, the language of the detective, right? He came at him. That's not investigative language, right? That's subjective, right? So I think if you listen to the autopsy report and you listen to Kevin's testimony, which is why he sits, and talks to me about it, you know what happened. He turned the corner and he was shot.
I hope, I really, really, really hope that you don't feel guilty because of his death, and so is your mother. I really hope she didn't die thinking, she could have done something better,
Well, I appreciate your saying that. I think that the larger point in that statement is what happens when our institutions fail us, right? When the failure of civil society happens on a systemic level, where does that go? Right? It's not a coincidence that both of my parents, as you see in the film, had traumatic brain injuries, right? That led to both of their deaths. When our civil society fails, there's no way, I think, to make sense of that failure other than to turn inward, right? That's why we have a society where injustice is too often, characterized as personal failing, right? And then it becomes the norm, and then it becomes expected, and then it's impossible to change.
Yeah, as you say in the film, to actually take some responsibility on your own is to somehow make it more understandable than the alternative. So it's actually, you're actually in a sense taking care of yourself by casting that blame on yourself.
Exactly. Otherwise, to accept, and I think that actually this is what our society, this is what America needs to do. It needs to accept that the civil institution of our criminal justice system is failing wholesale. If we all realize that, I think it would be, folks might just stop functioning. If we realize that there are millions of people who are in jail for long periods of time for stupid shit that no one, would be in jail for here, in the UK, there are all sorts of things that if everyone accepted that the criminal justice system fails, it would be easier for the families of victims of these crimes not to blame themselves, not to be cast as imperfect and therefore to blame.
Yance, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.